take this learning from here and focus on the preparation. Now I'll shift a little bit the gear on towards the technology, because you are known as a DevOps guy. What are the engineering best practices an organization should follow? So my question is, some CTO calls you, or you become a CTO of a small startup. So it's a very broad question, but we will go with as much as you can talk about. What are the engineering best practices and pattern you should adopt in your organization to do a smooth product development?
Great. I'm obviously a big fan of Scrum and Agile. I've been a certified Scrum Master for a long time. So I would go in and say, I really want you to start implementing an Agile form of based development. One of the other pieces of advice when I would say do that is do it by the book. Do not outsmart yourself and think that, oh, you know what, Agile is good, but we don't need daily stand-ups, or Agile is good, but we won't do a sprint review every sprint. We'll do a sprint review like every 6 months. Like, well, then you're just a waterfall team. Like, why are you calling yourselves an Agile team? Like, you're throwing away some of the best practices of that methodology. There's a reason that those meetings exist. There's a reason that Agile is shaped the way that it is, and that the meetings have certain rules, and we have those rituals that we do every time. There's value in them. So when you omit one or just decide you don't need one, you're also saying, I don't need any of the value that comes from that meeting. I find that people drop daily stand-ups, for example, because they take too long. Well, daily stand-ups should not take too long. That's a failure on your implementation. Either your team is too big or you're not running the meeting correctly, but you don't not do the meeting because you don't know how to run it. You learn how to run the meeting in 15 minutes or less, and then you get back to work again, and then you get the value out of that constant ability to inspect and adapt your process on a daily basis. And I meet too many companies who tell me, oh yeah, we tried Agile, it didn't work, or we tried Scrum, it didn't work. And the first thing I say is like, talk to me about your process. What did you do differently, right? Well, we did Scrum, but, and as soon as they say but, I'm like, no, you didn't do Scrum. Then if you didn't do sprint reviews at the end of every sprint, then you weren't doing Scrum. You were doing something else, but stop saying Scrum failed because you didn't do it. So my advice to a company who wants to figure out how they're going to be able to deploy software on a regular basis is start getting really good at Agile and Scrum. Because what I think, and I think Sam Guckenheimer said this, was that DevOps is the second decade of Agile. When you get really good at producing increments of shippable software, which is the goal of Agile, and let's be very clear, Agile makes no mentions of shipping software. All it says is produce an increment of shippable software, potentially shippable software at that, right? So when you get a company really good at that, and every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, they're doing a sprint review of software that's potentially shippable, but then it takes months and months to get this code into production, it shines a really bright light on the fact that you're now really good at producing value, but you're not really good at shipping value. And that's why DevOps is the natural progression to, we're really good now at doing Agile. We're really good at producing these increments of shippable software, but why is it such a manual, pain, arduous task to get it into production? Let's start doing some DevOps best practices. So I would start with Agile. Personally.
So one question I have, and a lot of people talk about Agile, what are your take on the documentation side? Because often I hear people say, hey, we are Agile, so don't want to write any documentation or a functional spec or something.
I think that's ridiculous, right? Because the Agile Manifesto does not say not write docs. It says we value working software over documentation, not instead of documentation.
True.
You should be spending at least 20% of your current sprint grooming the backlog for your next sprint. During that grooming process, I had designers writing specs for what the colors buttons are going to be. I had designers writing specs talking about when do we use a drop down versus radio buttons versus checkboxes. I had people writing design documents for what that next thing should look like, what we're going to be working on in the next sprint, not this sprint, right? So we always spend at least 20% of our available capacity in the current sprint dealing with the documentations, the grooming, and the clarification of the items that we might do the next sprint. It's called grooming your product backlog. So that's where that documentation time starts to come in. It's not we don't have to document now, we're called Agile. It's like, that's not even remotely true.
Okay, good.
When I think about DevOps, the best practices apply no matter what size company you are. I do DevOps best practices when I'm the only developer on the project. I still use continuous integration, CI/CD. I do the proper branching strategy. I was an athlete when I was younger, and I was always taught you play how you practice. So I'm not going to develop one way by myself and then try to go be a part of a team and they do everything differently. So I do best practices no matter if I'm alone or if I'm on a big giant team like the Azure Devops team, which at its height had like 50 different feature teams all working together. So if no matter where you are on that spectrum, the DevOps best practices like infrastructure as code, collaboration and communication across all your teams, getting everyone involved in your planning are good no matter what size company you are. But one of the things that I would do to break down some of those silos is during the planning of a new feature or a new offering, bring in the operations people, bring in the QA people, bring in the SREs, and bring in the security people to the very first meeting you're going to have about what this feature looks like. Historically, when I take over Scrum teams, I find out very often that the QA team is not part of the Scrum team. The QA team is a completely separate organization that the Scrum team will eventually throw their code over the fence to, and then they will have to then test this code and then send back all these bugs to the particular team. That, first of all, slows you down. Second of all, the item that you produced was not potentially shippable because it hasn't even been tested yet. Those QA people needed to be involved in the actual team itself. Another thing that I find out when I don't have them involved, and I'm just using QA and dev as an example, but this happens no matter what, substitute whatever pillar or silo you want with QA, this happens across the board. When I bring the QA people into the conversation up front, we save a lot of time because the QA person might be logging bugs that aren't bugs because they weren't there when we were making the decisions on why it behaved that way. And just because it didn't meet their expectations, they log it as a bug when it's working as designed. But how are they supposed to know it's working as designed? Because they weren't a part of the planning meeting. So when I bring them into the planning meeting with us, we end up with better requirements because the QA person has an opportunity to ask those questions while we're just on paper, while we're just in our heads, while we're just designing. And it's so much cheaper to change things when we haven't written anything. Because even if the QA person's idea is better and right, we've already spent months writing this code. We're just going to have to figure out a way to make this work because, yeah, it's a better idea, but we don't have time to make that change or that improvement because we have all this other backlog just pushing us towards another deadline. But had you had that person in the conversation in the beginning, you wouldn't have made this mistake and you would have had a better product, and their testing would be faster because they have an idea of what to expect. They're not getting a black box, which they have to first dissect and understand what it's supposed to do, and then write tests against it, and then go run those tests. If they're part of the planning, they can be designing the test and writing the test while you're writing the code. So that when you throw it over the fence to them, and it shouldn't be a fence, when you hand it over to them, they know exactly how they're going to attack that code. And they'll be able to give you estimates on how long it'll take them to be able to test that code. And then you actually will be able to tell your stakeholder when you will be done with the feature. You're not done just because it's code complete. You're done when it's tested and ready to be shipped. And it's not ready to be shipped unless QA has seen it. It's not ready to ship unless the infrastructure is in place, right? So you should have brought the infrastructure team in when you're talking about writing microservices and determine if you're going to be using Kubernetes or not. How many nodes is your Kubernetes cluster going to need? Because I can be provisioning that for you now so that when the feature's done, we're ready to go ahead and deploy into that thing versus you having to send in a request now that you've done some testing and realize that you need this cluster that we don't even have the space for now. But had you known that you were going to be constrained on the cluster size that you're going to be able to use, you might have architected this differently, right? If you know you didn't have infinite nodes, infinite memory, you might have thought about the problem differently. But you didn't know that because you didn't involve the QA people. You didn't involve the operations people. You didn't involve security people. You didn't involve all these people when you were designing this thing. And had you done that, all these questions and all these rough edges would have been filed away, and you would have had a product backlog item that just told you exactly what needed to be done at every stage of your deployment. So those silos are bad, right? Because and you got to break those down. And the way you break them down is inviting those people into the earlier stages of your application development.
Right. Very good point. I want to ask you one more clarifying thing. A few years back, I think 7, 8 years back, there was a thing came like no more testing. Even in Microsoft, we got rid of all the testers and converted them into dev. So the dev owns the testing. Now, people took the next step and they say, hey, I don't need a QA team also. So QA is gone and test is gone. It's all dev. So I want to know from your experience, do you think the QA team still needed a team which is out of devs and who are basically a wall of quality, or not needed and it's all devs are responsible for quality also? Where do you find yourself?
It depends on the type of software that you write. The reason that, and I think that the example you're talking about is specifically the Azure DevOps team, right? Because there are QA teams inside of Microsoft, right? But the Azure DevOps team, who happens to use the exact product that they produce, and they use it before any of our customers do, they are our first line of testers, right? We didn't need another batch, because when you dog food is what we call it in the United States, some people call it drinking your own wine in Europe. When you use the software that you develop, you are your manual testers. You're doing the exploratory testing every single day. And I love the idea of putting the onus on the engineers to design the quality into the product versus bolt the quality on after, when all the bugs come back from the QA team, right? But if you're not in a very unique, and I tell all of our customers this, on the Azure DevOps team, we were in a very unique position to where we got to use the software that we actually were producing for our customers. Now, if you're writing trucking software that manages truck inventory and you don't drive a truck, you don't actually get to use your software like the truckers will use your software, like the drivers will use your software. You're not in that same headspace. You want to get as close to it as you can so you can kind of empathize with them and write the right features. But you will probably need another team that is closer to that side of the house, who's going to be able to look at this software in a way that's closer to the way that the actual users of your software are going to be able to use it. I'm also a big fan of exploratory testing, which I think everyone should do. And it's hard, in my opinion, for developers to break their own software. So what I've seen a lot of developers do is, I'll go break my buddy's software and they'll break my software, but you don't exploratory test your own software, because you're going to treat your software really nice, right? You're going to put all the right values in the right place, and you're going to do all, it's going to look perfect and it's going to work perfect. But
always bugs in the
break my friend's software, I'm going to have a blast breaking my friend's software, right? So that's how I do that too. So just to really quickly answer your question, I think it depends on the type of software that you're writing. And if you are a user of the software that you write, I think if your developers are developing developers tools like we were in Azure DevOps, the need for that external team was mitigated by the fact that we had to use the product ourselves. But if you don't, then I think a QA team adds a lot of value.
Right. Okay, this is good to know, because it's not one solution for all the problems. Don't get rid of QA team if you are not dogfooding your own software. You do need that person. In fact, when this change happened, I missed having the test manager in the room, because he used to squash all this, overly optimistic devs coming in and saying, yeah, we'll ship it this date and that date. And test manager used to be there and he said, now I want this much time to test and this, and and so I missed initially him not being in the room, but later on, you take that responsibility.
Exactly.
The manager becomes the test manager. And then it was a learning experience for few months, but very soon you realize, and it makes the software quality better, because now dev doesn't have anybody to point finger at that, hey, they didn't find the bug.
Yeah, and also we had that, we kind of implemented the same if you wrote it, you run it mentality at Microsoft, which means in the past, I remember when I worked at Compaq, I would write software, I would not write any test. Wouldn't write unit tests, wouldn't run manual tests. And I would throw it over to the QA team. And the QA team would test it. And if they ever even, I remember one QA person came over and asked me where the source code was. I was like, what do you need my source code from? Like, just go test my software from the outside. You don't get to go on the inside. But I didn't realize then how clever that tester was being. He's like, I want to know what the code looks like and see if I can get parameters from the outside on the inside in the wrong way. So he was ahead of his time at that point. But the thing is that was someone else's responsibility. So I never wrote unit tests. And the reason that I didn't care about that is because once the code was in production and the software went down, someone else got called at 3 o'clock in the morning, not me, right? Even though I wrote the code, even though it's my bug, some poor IT person is on the phone trying to troubleshoot why my software is not running. I sleep through the night perfectly. So there's no consequences for my bad behavior. But when you're the person that they call at 2 o'clock in the morning, when the application crashes because you wrote that software, all of a sudden you become much better at quality. You become a lot better at writing unit tests because you want to sleep at night. There's a consequence for your bad behavior. But if I have no consequences for my bad behavior, I'll keep doing what's easiest for me. And not writing tests is easiest for me. So I thought that was really important, that we didn't just get rid of our QA team. We also said, you are now responsible for the live side of this particular application. And should it go down, one of you is waking up And then the
Right.
whole team is now having to pay the price for poor quality. So I am going to test my peers' code a little bit harder than I would before. I am going to be reviewing your pull request a little bit more closely to make sure that the code coverage is high and that you wrote the necessary unit test. Because I don't want to be woken up when I'm on call because you didn't write a unit test. You start making the entire team start to realize that one of us messes up, we all pay the price for that. So let's start making sure we make each other, like, cover each other's back a little bit.
Right.
And a lot of companies just get rid of QA. And then you have that long months of time before people realize that, oh, it's our quality is now our responsibility. Make them run the software. Wake them up at 3 o'clock in the morning. See how fast your quality goes up.
Exactly. Cool. Yeah, very good point.